I had always known my grandpa as the wise and kind figure in my life. He was always there for me, telling me stories, offering advice and giving me warmth when I needed it. He had been a constant presence since I could remember, with his gentle smile and soft voice. But lately, something about the way he looked at me started to feel different. I couldn't explain it at first, but I felt it in the way his eyes followed me around the room. When we sat together, there was a curiosity in them, a look I had noticed before. It was on one of those quiet afternoons when the sun was setting, casting golden hues across the living room, that he invited me over to his house. He had always been someone who loved sharing his life with me, but this invitation felt different. Grandpa wasn't the kind of person to just call me over for no reason. I had no idea what he wanted, but I could feel something in my gut, telling me that this wasn't going to be a regular visit. When I arrived at Grandpa's house, the familiar smell of old wood and warm tea filled the air, making me feel both comforted and a little curious. It always smelled like this, like a place where stories and memories were kept safe in the air. The house looked the same as I remembered, cozy with wooden floors that creaked beneath my feet. Grandpa loved this place. It had been his home for as long as I could remember. I walked through the hallway and into the living room. Grandpa was sitting in his favorite chair by the window, staring out into the garden. The garden was full of flowers that bloomed in bright colors, and the sun was shining softly through the leaves of the big tree. Outside, birds were singing and the wind was gently blowing, making everything seem peaceful. But there was something in the air that made my heart race a little faster. It wasn't the usual warmth I felt when I visited. There was something else, something I couldn't put my finger on. Grandpa didn't notice me right away. He seemed lost in his thoughts, as if he was thinking about something far away. I stood there for a moment watching him. His gray hair looked even whiter today, and his glasses were perched on the edge of his nose. His hands, the ones that had always been so strong and comforting, rested on the arms of his chair. He looked like he was waiting for something, but I couldn't tell what. Suddenly, he turned his head slowly when he heard my footsteps. His eyes, usually full of warmth, were a little different today, like they were trying to tell me something without using words. His gaze met mine, and I felt a mix of familiarity and confusion. It was like he was seeing me for the first time, or maybe he was seeing me in a way I hadn't noticed before. "Ah, you're here," he said, his voice low but kind. He smiled, but it wasn't the usual bright smile I was used to. It was softer, almost like he was thinking about something important. "Come sit down, my dear," he added, patting the space next to him. I hesitated for a moment, feeling an odd tension in the room. But then I walked over and sat beside him. The chair was warm from the sunlight, and I could feel the soft cushions beneath me. There was a long silence, the kind where you can hear the wind outside, and the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Grandpa didn't say anything for a while. He just looked out the window again, his eyes distant. I couldn't help but wonder what was going on in his mind. Grandpa had always been the one who told the stories, the one who asked questions, and now it seemed like he was waiting for me to speak. "Ah, you're here, my dear," he said softly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. I returned his smile but couldn't shake off the strange feeling. I walked over to him, giving him a peg on the cheek, like I always did when I visited. He reached up to gently hold my hand as I stood by his chair. Looking down at him, "You've grown so much," he said quietly, "so much since you were a little one." I nodded, trying to keep the conversation light, but his gaze lingered on me in a way that made me uncomfortable. There was an intensity in his eyes that I couldn't understand. "Grandpa, what's wrong?" I asked, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that was creeping over me. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at me thoughtfully, his wrinkled hands slowly moving over the armrest of the chair. After a long pause, he spoke again, his voice even quieter now. "You're a woman now. "Aren't you?" he said softly. The words hit me like a bolt of lightning. My heart raced as I looked at him in confusion. What did he mean Grandpa had always been kind and loving? But this didn't seem right. I took a step back, unsure of what to say. His words didn't make sense, but his expression was earnest, and for a moment I wondered if I had misheard him. "Grandpa, what are you saying?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked at me, then really looked at me, as though seeing me for the first time. In a way I had never experienced before. There was a strange, almost sad look in his eyes, as if he was grappling with something deep inside. His hands trembled slightly as he reached out. Grasping mine, "I've always loved you. My dear, you're my family, my blood," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "But there's something I've been keeping hidden for a long time." I felt my breath catch in my throat. Something wasn't right. My mind raced and I tried to step back. But he held onto my hand tightly, his grip firm but gentle. I could feel his strength, the years of experience, the weight of his presence. It was almost as if he was trying to communicate something unspoken, something that I wasn't ready to hear. "Grandpa, I don't understand," I whispered, my voice trembling. He closed his eyes for a moment, as though gathering his thoughts. When he opened them again, his gaze softened and I saw the pain there. "I know it may seem strange and I don't know how to explain it, but I've always had feelings for you," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The words felt like a slap to my face. My body went cold and I felt my stomach turn. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was my grandpa, the man who had raised me, who had always been there for me, who had protected me. How could he say something like that? I pulled my hand away from his, backing up, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood there still in shock, unsure of what to say or do. Grandpa sat back down in his chair slowly, his eyes distant as though he was looking back in time. Lost in thought, he seemed different now, as if the weight of his confession had drained him of his usual warmth. I hesitated for a moment before I sat down across from him, trying to steady my racing heart. "Come sit," he said, his voice softer than before. "Let me tell you something. Let me explain why I said those things." I sat still, unsure of where this conversation was heading. But there was something about the way he spoke that made me want to listen. He cleared his throat and looked at me, almost as if he was choosing his words carefully. "Long before I became the man you know me as today," he began, "I was young, just like you, full of dreams and hopes and a heart that was eager to love. I met your grandmother when I was in my 20s. She was beautiful, kind-hearted, and full of life. We connected in a way that I can't even put into words. She was the love of my life." I listened intently, trying to keep my emotions in check, as his words carried me into a different time, a different place. I could tell that his voice softened as he spoke about Grandma. There was love in his eyes, but also a hint of sadness, as if remembering her brought back bittersweet memories. "We were married for many years," he continued, his voice calm but filled with a deep affection. "And throughout those years, we shared everything. But the most important thing was our love for each other, especially when it came to being together in bed." I felt my face flush with embarrassment. I didn't know what to say. It felt awkward, but I didn't want to interrupt him. He was my grandpa after all, and he was sharing something personal, something I had never really thought about before. "Your grandmother," he went on, "was a woman with so much experience. She taught me things that I didn't understand when I was young. She was always patient, always gentle, and she knew how to make me feel like the luckiest man in the world. Before she passed away, she always told me how much she cherished the moments we shared in our bed. It was not just about physical love. It was about trust, understanding, and being there for each other in every way." I nodded, trying to grasp what he was saying. The picture he painted of Grandma was beautiful, but the words he used made me feel uneasy. I never thought about my grandparents in that way. And now, hearing him speak about their relationship in such an intimate manner made me squirm a little. She was my partner in every sense. Grandpa said, his voice tinged with a sadness I hadn't heard before. And when she passed, a part of me went with her. You don't understand the emptiness that comes with losing someone you've loved for so long. But that's life. People leave and we have to move on. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't imagine losing someone I loved so deeply. My thoughts swirled around in my head, and the uncomfortable feeling I had earlier was still there, lingering in the air. But Grandpa's story seemed to make him feel better, as if talking about Grandma, even in this way, brought some peace to his heart. After a moment of silence, Grandpa turned to me, his eyes sharp and questioning. "Tell me, do you have a boyfriend?" He asked, his voice steady but filled with curiosity. I was caught off guard. My mind raced, trying to come up with an answer. But my throat tightened. I had never expected him to ask me something like that. My thoughts went straight to my teenage years. The boys I had liked but never really pursued anything serious. The idea of a boyfriend felt so distant in that moment, almost irrelevant, compared to the gravity of what we had just discussed. "No," I said quietly, looking down at my hands, trying to avoid his gaze. Grandpa's expression didn't change much, but I could see a flicker of something in his eyes. It wasn't disappointment, but more like an understanding, as if he expected this answer. "You're still young," he said, nodding slowly. "You have time. But you must remember this. My dear, love is a beautiful thing, but it comes with its own lessons. When you find someone, don't take it lightly. Cherish them, trust them, and make sure they cherish you in return. Don't rush into anything. Take your time and let love come naturally." I felt a lump form in my throat as his words sank in. There was something in his tone, something so wise and deep, that made me think of my own future, of relationships I hadn't even thought about yet. He wasn't just talking about love between a man and a woman. He was talking about respect, trust, and understanding values that went beyond romance. Grandpa leaned back in his chair, his eyes looking tired but peaceful, as if sharing this story had relieved a burden from his heart. "I never wanted you to feel uncomfortable," he said, his voice quieter now. "I just wanted you to understand that love is more than what you see in the movies. It's more than just the good times. It's about knowing each other deeply and being there for one another." Through it all, I sat there for a long time, processing everything he had shared. His words had made me think about love in a different way, something deeper and more meaningful than I had realized. But there was still an odd feeling in my chest, something that made me uneasy, as if I wasn't quite sure where to place everything he had said. He then went on and said, "I have a favor to ask, my dear." I was a little surprised, but I nodded for him to continue. He hesitated for a moment, then spoke again. "It's been a long time since I felt the touch of a lady. But you're different. You're calm, understanding. And you always listen to me. You understand me better than most." I wasn't sure where this conversation was going, but I stayed silent, waiting for him to explain. Grandpa leaned forward, his eyes filled with sincerity. "I want to guide you for the future, especially when it comes to relationships. When you find a boyfriend or husband, there will be times when you need to know certain things, especially in the bedroom. I've learned a lot over the years, skills that women appreciate. I think it's important that you know these things." I felt a mix of curiosity and confusion. "What do you mean, Grandpa?" I asked, unsure of what he was suggesting. Grandpa smiled gently. "I know you might find this strange, but I want to help you prepare for the future. It's not just about love and affection. It's about understanding the needs of your partner, knowing how to make your relationship stronger in every way." I couldn't deny that I was curious. Grandpa had always been full of wisdom, and maybe, just maybe, His guidance could help me when the time came. Grandpa looked at me thoughtfully, as if he was about to ask something important. "I need to ask you something, my dear," he said, his voice steady but gentle. "Are you still a virgin?" I felt a little uncomfortable with the question, but I didn't want to lie to him. I took a deep breath and answered honestly, "No, Grandpa. My former boyfriend, he was the one. We were together for 3 months, but we broke up after that." Grandpa nodded quietly as if he understood. "And what about now? Are you seeing anyone?" I shook my head. "No, Grandpa. Right now I'm single. I'm focusing on myself." He seemed to think for a moment before continuing, his eyes kind but serious. "It's good that you're being honest with me. Relationships can be complicated, but it's important to know what you want and where you're heading." He looked at me with a serious expression and asked if I was ready to try some experiments with him. In bed, he promised that he could teach me things that would make my husband, in the future, love me more. In the bedroom, his words were soft but convincing, and something in me felt curious. I wasn't sure at first, but my body seemed to say yes. I felt a strange mix of excitement and nervousness. Yet I found myself nodding and agreeing to his suggestion. Without saying anything more, he stood up slowly, his movements confident. He walked over to the corner of the room, picked up a soft towel and handed it to me gently. "Take a shower," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You'll feel better afterward." I hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the situation. But then I decided to go along with it. I took the towel from his hand and headed to the bathroom. My thoughts swirling, what was I getting myself into? What would happen next? I wasn't sure, but there was a strange sense of anticipation in the air, and I couldn't help but wonder if I was about to experience something new, something exciting. After taking the shower, I felt refreshed and cool, as if all the tension had washed away with the water. The steam from the shower still lingered around me as I wrapped myself in the soft towel. Feeling its warmth against my skin, I stepped out of the bathroom, my mind still racing with thoughts of what had just happened. But I tried to focus on the feeling of being clean and relaxed. When I walked into the room, I noticed that he was already on the bed, lying back with his arms stretched out, looking comfortable. He didn't say much at first, just gazed at me with an intensity that made my heart beat faster. Then in a quiet but firm voice, he said, "Come over." His words felt like an invitation, but I couldn't shake the nervousness in my stomach. For a moment I hesitated, unsure of what exactly he wanted. But something inside me pushed me forward, urging me to take that step. So slowly I walked over to him, wondering what would happen next. When I saw him, his pole was standing, big, and he asked me to experiment with it. His was warmed and soft. At this age, I thought pole can't stand big, but it was. He guided me and taught me how to handle it properly. As I learned, I could tell he appreciated my efforts, and it brought him enjoyment. After a while, he asked me to turn around as he let his pole in through me. It was not successful, as this was my first time. But he kept going, and it finally entered. It was a new feeling, and I was enjoying it from the back for the first time. After a while, Grandpa was happy, and I was happy also. He enjoys it. I think Grandpa went back to his old self. Gentle, loving and wise, he still told me stories, still offered advice, and his smile gradually returned to the warmth it had always had. But there was something different now, an unspoken understanding between us, a silent agreement that we would never speak of that conversation again. It was as though we both knew that, no matter how much we tried to pretend, things would never be exactly the same. But that was okay. I learned to accept that my relationship with Grandpa could still be a source of love and support. Even if it wasn't perfect anymore, I had to let go of the fear and the confusion, to replace it with a new kind of strength, a strength that allowed me to move forward with my life. Even though the past was still a shadow that followed me, In time, I realized that healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant finding peace with the broken parts of the past and allowing ourselves to rebuild, not as we once were, but as we needed to be. And in that rebuilding, there was room for love, for forgiveness, and for the hope that despite everything, we could still move forward together. As Grandpa and I sat by the window once more, watching the sun set over the garden, I took his hand this time with a sense of understanding and acceptance. There was still love there, a different kind of love, but love nonetheless, and maybe in the end that was enough.